Good morning. I have the big opportunity to speak with a big man. His name is Martin Gak. He have Bessarabian roots. He is a journalist on uh, Deutsche Welle, and he have a big thing. I study his biography. It's a big man. Thank you very much for your time.
Kind of you. I'm tall, but I'm not very big, I will say. But thank you. It's
Let's
nice.
let's speak about your family. You have Bessarabian roots. Who is this ancestry?
So the Basarabian roots for me are very, very direct, actually. I mean, most Argentinian Jews, I am a Jew from Argentina, would have essentially about, at this stage, people in my age would normally have about 3 generations back. Some of them would have grandparents, but mostly would be great grandparents that came from Europe to Argentina. In my case, 3 of my grandparents, so the parents of my father, were actually born in Argentina. The father of my mother was born in Argentina. But the mother of my mother, that would be my maternal grandmother, who I was very, very, very close to. I mean, really just somebody who was, extremely important, perhaps outside of my parents, the most important person in my childhood and my life, really, until she died in 2005, 2006, was my maternal grandmother, my mother's mother. And she was born actually in Orhei.
Mm-hmm.
She was born in Orhei we believe around 1907.
Mm-hmm.
Documents were lost in the movement from Orhei or from Europe to Argentina. And the question was always, where was she from? I mean, she was asked very often, where was she from? Keep in mind that when she was, there was no Moldova. Romania had lost the territory of Orhei, of Bessarabia, to the Russian gubernia. Interestingly enough, my great-grandparents, so her parents, who were both born in Orhei, one was born in Romania, the other one was born in Russia, only a couple of blocks away in the same city, but in 2 different countries. So it shows you the movement of the border. And my grandmother would say that she was Bessarabian, but she would also say that she was essentially Romanian. And, running in the family, there was a pretty strong, in the family, I would say in my grandmother's family, there was a pretty strong anti-Russian sentiment and very pro-Romanian.
Mm-hmm.
The way that I always understood that is that the Jewish family felt quite protected by the Romanian government and felt that a lot of what happened during the pogroms in 1907, so 1905 up to 1907, 1908, because it was a chain, had a lot to do with the Russian influence and Russian influence, anti-Semitism in the, essentially Russian propelled anti-Semitism in the region. Little did I know, actually, that I need to find the name, but there was one of the people that was, let me see if I can find it. One of the people that was one of the main, I suppose, propellers of the pogrom, which was actually a Russian journalist in Chisinau, had been also the first editor of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So I mean, a very august, anti-Semitic tradition, I suppose. Anyway, so that's the story. Essentially, the connection is that for me, it was directly from my grandmother's mouth. The idea of Bessarabia. That said, I mean, she arrived in Argentina with 6 or 7 months of age. She herself had no memory of Orhei, but nonetheless, all her brothers and sisters, who were much, much older than her, almost 10, 15 years older than her, they all had very clear memories of life in Orhei.
Mm-hmm. Tell me, please, the history of fled Bessarabia. How it is?
So that was actually a pretty remarkable piece of story, and it was one that the family repeated for a very, very long time until today. It turns out that my great-grandfather, whose name was Samuel or Shmil, had to bribe a Cossack. So he bribed the Cossack, but then when he arrived to the border, it seems that he was betrayed by the Cossack, so he had to turn around and go back home. And his wife, that had been left with the children, saw him appear in a window after he was supposed not to come back and be in essentially crossing the Atlantic. And apparently she thought it was a ghost, so took it that the man had died. He didn't die. He had a second attempt, which I think that attempt was in 1909. And at that point, he did manage to get to Argentina and wait for the rest of his family. So about a year later, his wife, whose name was Rosa or Rais in Yiddish, they all spoke Yiddish, took the children, 5 children. I believe she also left with a sister and the child or 2 children of her sister. And essentially they made their way, mostly by foot, as far as the family tale goes, to Hamburg. And we know that in Hamburg they got on a transatlantic of I can't remember the name of the company, but the ship itself was the Cap Portugal, Cap Portugal, and then on the Cap Portugal they actually crossed the Atlantic, and then she reunited with her husband and with the father of the children in Argentina. So it's quite clear that crossing was really quite an epic, because they did have to, she did have to essentially cross a continent with 5 children on tow. And it's believed that she also carried with her a big jar of jam. This was actually also part of the family myth, a big jar of jam which broke on the transatlantic, falling on the family or something to that extent. So apparently some of the children were dosed in marmalade crossing the Atlantic. Probably, I assume, sour cherry marmalade.
How big is your dynasty in Argentina?
The family at this point is really quite big. I mean, my grandmother had I think 5 or 6 brothers and sisters. They almost all, with the exception of the youngest, which was Sarita, actually, so 5, Enrique, Samuel. I'm missing one here, Juana, which was the one that died before my mother was born, which was the eldest sister of my grandmother. So there are about 5 or 6 children to Samuel and Rosa, and they had different children. I mean, and they had, so now, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. So my assumption is that of that line of people coming out of Orhei, there has to be in Argentina at this point at least 30 people or 50 people, somewhere there. Many of them are still in contact. We're still in contact with, obviously, the brothers of my mother, brother and sister of my mother. I'm in contact with, but then there are farther cousins that are farther afield that, that I don't really know. It strikes me that the Basarabian Jewish community in Argentina must be fairly sizable. I think it's important to point out that the Argentine immigration was very mixed and very tolerant of each other. The country, as opposed to Americans, who really do have a very clear kind of cut down Italian Americans and Jewish Americans and Russian Americans. In Argentina, we never really had such thing. I mean, people were just Argentinians to a large degree. And among Jews, I mean, those communities mix very, very quickly. So it was very difficult. I mean, I don't really recall, other than German Jews and Hungarian Jews that continue to hold themselves as Hungarian Jews and German Jews. The rest of them, especially from the eastern countries, which was from the settlements, were really just, the Pale of settlements were really just very mixed. But I imagine that it's actually a fairly large community. In fact, one of the graves that I saw in Orhei had the name Filmus on it, which I think it's a very unusual Jewish last name. But as a matter of fact, we had a Jewish minister of education in Argentina whose name was Filmus. I'm
Daniel
sure
Filmus.
Sorry?
Daniel Filmus.
Daniel Filmus. Daniel Filmus. So I imagine that Filmus family must come from Orhei. I have never really heard the name anywhere else. It does not really sound to me like a Slavic name. It sounds to me perhaps like a Lithuanian name, perhaps. So that's, it's just a calculation, but I think that those families possibly come from that corner.
Yes, we know this man, he visited Moldova some time ago.
Okay, I didn't know that.
What did your grandparents do in Argentina in the early days?
My great-grandfather was what in English they call the cuentanik, which was somebody that would carry a bag with goods from door to door trying to sell them. At some point or other, he had a store where he was selling clothing, either old clothing or maybe fabrics. It's not entirely clear. And I think that his wife was essentially a housekeeper. I mean, just a housekeeper, sorry, housewife. In the next generation, they have two boys, Samuel and Enrique. And they became, Enrique became actually quite well-known doctor. So I mean, the next generation, the social ascent was actually quite quickly, and that meant that they procured a fairly stable life for the parents. In the next generation, there were all sorts of things. So my grandmother, after her husband died in '63, that was my grandfather, who I didn't meet. That family, the Sitlenoks, came from Kherson. In Ukraine. So all the families came from essentially the area. The other families, so the husband family came from Kherson. And then on my father's side, my grandmother's family came from the Vinnytsia Oblast, from a very small place called Pikiv, Stary Pikiv. And then the father came, the Gag last name comes from Odessa. Odessan Jews, and I would almost bet that the Gag family, I mean, if they were not exterminated by the Nazis in Odessa, they must still be there. So the thing about the next generation is that most of them did essentially middle class, very much middle class work, or upper middle class. I mean, the eldest son was a physician. The other son Samuel was a pharmacist. The youngest daughter, Sarita, was doing research associated with medicine. My grandmother was doing real estate. She was a salesperson after her husband died a couple of years later. And then the next generation, which was my mother's generation, they were really just completely completely folded into the middle class. They were really people that had a much more stable life and much more stable economy. Also, the Jewish community in Argentina, despite, sporadic anti-Semitism. I mean, Argentina is very much like Italy. There is some residual racism, but mostly people are classist. So that means that you can be a Jew, or you can be Black, or you can be, Chinese. But if you have enough money, then the tendency, at least, is to fold you into the system. There are, of course, countries where I think the racial question, such as Spain, for instance, where the racial question is much more prevalent.
What do your grandmother tell about Moldova? What national dishes do you know, or what do you know about Moldova?
I mean, so I think I should say that while most people think that the conversations about food are somewhat quaint or funny or cute, I tend to think that those are some of the most important conversations that one has about culture. And this is something that I experienced very directly with Palestinian friends of mine who haven't actually been back to Palestinian houses of their great-grandparents. in generations, maybe 3 generations. I mean, I have some very good friends who grew up whose great-grandfather parents had lived in Jerusalem. And though they did not carry, obviously, the land or the house with them, and they could not go back because of the political situation, they would still cook dishes, sometimes with ingredients that could no longer be found. So those ingredients, let's say olives, for instance, if you were a Palestinian in New York, or if you were a Palestinian in Boston, or if you were a Palestinian in Latin America, in Buenos Aires, where there are no olives, there are olives in other parts of the country. Those olives that you would eat as a Palestinian in those places had a very, very strong relation with the geography of Palestine, right? I mean, it was something that basically, and this is something that I've seen in reverse, and I know I'm straying a little bit here, but this we drink in Argentina mate, which is a type of tea that is drunk in a very funny kind of pumpkin with a straw. And the second biggest importer of mate in the world was Syria. And the reason for that was that we had a very, very large Syrian Lebanese community at the turn of the century. We still do, but you would not be able to find them because, again, as I was saying, Argentina really integrated these communities. And it turns out that many of the Syrians who actually got very used to drinking mate in Argentina went back to Syria, and basically they missed the mate. So, I mean, in a sense, the experience of mate, the experience of holding this thing and drinking, and signified not Syria, but like for them was a very clear marker, like almost a footprint of their Argentinian life, but now in the Middle East. So at home, we had things that were very, very, very definitely pointed to places which we didn't know. The names that I know for them mostly were Yiddish names. So being Yiddish names, it took me an extremely long time to find them. Some of them were very easy. So we had things like Bariniki, which in Yiddish my grandmother would call Bareneke. We had things such as Knedalech in Yiddish, which then I found out were the Knudeln or the Knedelchen from Germany. In Germany, they're eaten, which is old bread. And these were particularly eaten during Passover, but old bread that was glummed together with egg and then very softly boiled, which Americans call matzo balls. But then there were 2 things that probably for me are really the closest to my experience of my grandmother, and for me still are big expressions of how much I miss her. One of them was what she called vishnik, and vishnik in Buenos Aires you could not get. Vishnik meant that you needed to get sour cherries, and you needed to put them in sugar and then in alcohol. So vishnik was something that was constantly discussed in my house. Every summer, the question was how we were going. I mean, I'm not talking about the 20s or 30s or 50s. I'm talking all the way to the 90s. How are we going to find sour cherries for the vishnik? And of course, they couldn't find sour cherries for the vishnik. So one year, the entire family would go for summer vacations to Uruguay because it was right next to us. And somehow that summer, they managed to find a very large batch of sour cherries. So my grandmother, her name, actually I should mention her name, which I didn't. Her name in Spanish was Bessie, very likely Basia, and in Yiddish she was called Basele. She actually put the cherries and she made in these very large donjons, which were put in the garage of the house, in the parking of the house. I remember this green glass with all these like sour cherries behind it and sugar. And there was a piece of gas, a piece of the thing that one puts over wounds, directly on it with a rubber band. There were 3 or 4 of those. For 2 or 3 years, those things sat there, and not knowing, of course, children didn't know what these things were. We're very, very young then. But then the vishnik was moved to different bottles, and one of them was given to my mother, one of them to each of my uncles, and then one stayed with my grandmother. And until I left Argentina, which I left in 1993, I would go back, and the bottle of vishnik had no longer the liquor inside the Vishnova, right? Or
Vishnovka.
Vishnovka. So it had no longer Vishnovka, but the sour cherries were still inside. And actually, I should mention this. The most important part for us children were actually the cherries, not the alcohol, because what we would do is we would go behind her back with netting needles. She used to net, net crochet and things of the kind. She had this very long gray netting needles, and we would go there and we would fish cherries from the bottle, which had been macerating for probably like 25 years or something like that. So, because I have a very good neighbor here who is Romanian, and he's a very, very good friend, Florin, I asked Florin if he had any idea what he was talking about. And of course, he immediately knew what I was talking about. He told me, yes, what you're talking about is Vishnopska. And I actually, at that point, I started to look, okay, Vishnopska, Bessarabia. And funny enough, of course, I found exactly the same recipe, which I can give it to you. It's like 1-to-1 cherries and sugar, 60 days. And then, according to my grandmother, at least, and then pure alcohol, 1-to-1, and then let it sit for 2 years. That was her. It's incredible that you can. So I think that this is the thing that to me remains interesting, which is that in this one sentence, which is sugar and cherries 1-to-1, 60 days, then 1-to-1 alcohol, she carried the entire landscape of Bessarabia, the cherry trees, the sugar, the sense of people coming together around the Vishnik, the Vishnovska, and sitting down and drinking. All of these experiences, that landscape, those trees, those skies were carried in that sentence for them. And I find that absolutely breathtaking. Still today, I find it incredibly moving. The other thing that was probably even more important than the Vishnik was actually what at home was called cheese culn. So in Spanish was culn de queso. Mm-hmm. Culn de queso. And I can tell you, I mean, without a joke, I spent the last probably 20 years trying to figure out where this came from, because knowing very well the Jewish community in Argentina, and being somebody that I'm very interested in literature, I love music, but there is nothing that I like more than food. Food for me is actually a very important part of my day. I cook a lot. So it was very interesting to figure out what was this thing. And I knew no families around us that had this dish in their family cookbook. They would make other things. They would make varenikis, but there was no kuln. So obviously, over the last few years, having this neighbor, Florin Boinesco, I went to him and I said, okay, I mean, you come from the region. Have you ever heard of this thing? And I described it essentially as a malfatti, an Italian gnocco made of like ricotta with some flour. And, he said, no, it doesn't really, it doesn't really sound like anything I know. I mean, it's just maybe not. And we went through the entire gamut, but I couldn't find it. So then finally, I landed in Moldova. And when I landed in Moldova, I asked about this thing, and immediately I was told that what I was talking about was Levini Vareniki. And I can tell you that sitting there, like eating my first bite of essentially Moldovan Levini Vareniki, I had tears coming down my eyes, because it was essentially everything about it, the consistency, that my grandmother would make them very, very malformed. So I always wonder, why was everything else that was presented? There was a lot of work in forming them. But when you got Levini Vareniki, it looked like something that had just fallen out of like a track. It had no form, and she would actually just put them in a bowl and just put heavy cream on it, and sometimes a little sugar. In my house, they were not eaten with marmalade, which I found is absolutely wonderful. And yeah, I mean, I sat down there sort of eating these things in Chisinau, my first or second day, sitting at a what is it called? placenta, la placenta. I ate them, and it was just incredible. I mean, it was this experience of, finding something that you have tried to understand about yourself for a very, very, very long time, and that, I think that in a way, food is like, I'm sorry for the comparison, but food in some sense is like a dog. Taste is like a dog. It's very honest. You cannot reason with the dog. You cannot you can bribe them maybe, but there is always, there is a brutal honesty about the taste, right? I mean, you taste these things and you can say, okay, this is the flavor of my childhood. No, this is not what I'm looking for. And this clearly was the flavor of my childhood. This clearly was the things that my grandmother was putting in front of us with her hands. And clearly this was sort of, in some sense, was the place from where these things were pointing to, right? I mean, it's silly to say, but the culn de queso, which was actually Livini Vareniki, was in some sense pointing to Basarabia, right? Pointed to something that was very, I mean, somebody was asking me when I was in Orhei, somebody asked me, when was the first time you heard about Orhei, or when was the time you heard about Basarabia? And I said, there was no first time. It was always there, even before I was born, right? I mean, the name was already there. I was born into the name of Basarabia, the name, my grandmother's accent. I mean, she arrived at 6 months old, but she spoke until the day she died with an accent. So that to me, so I don't know how good of an answer is that in terms of perhaps more, the literature and the thought. And for me, food played a very, very, very big part of it. And then also we have some idea, but very distant, of how the town might have looked like. I know that my great-grandparents lived in a house that had cows. They had the cows below and they slept all above. So apparently it was a fairly poor family. Although I think in Orhei there were some very rich Jewish families, but I don't think this was one of them. But all that information is much more circumstantial. It's one that I have heard, but I cannot confirm. About the culn de queso being Livini Vareniki, I can absolutely confirm it. I think that that's absolutely the case.
Have you had the communication with families in Argentina who also come from Bessarabia?
No. And this is actually also very strange to me now that I think about it, because, I think first that there are probably quite a few families from Jews from Bessarabia. I mean, I think that there was, Belts was maybe more famous than Orhei, but I think that there were, in any case, quite a few families. But I think that because of the integration, people essentially very quickly just became Jews or just became Argentinians. And they lost a bit of this. When you would talk in the family context, those places were much more important. But it is kind of remarkable the amount of people I know would say, yeah, my grandfather was born in Poland, and you would ask where in Poland, and they would not know.
In Argentina, exists another families from Bessarabia, like Dynasty Grubu-Copatel, maybe you know?
Yeah. The Grubu-Copatel is a very well-known family, and they were now they have moved some of the industry to Uruguay. It's a family that had a very, very large agro industry, right? I mean, they did a lot of, the Grubu-Copatel had done a lot of stuff with soy.
Yes, and another family, Rosichner, the advisor of President of Argentina.
Yeah, no, I didn't know that Rosichner was from Bessarabia.
And the Dynasty Vertain, maybe you know?
No.
Vertain.
Huertain. The Huertains. Okay, that I didn't know. And okay, so here is a perfect example. Daniel Huertain was actually, for many, many years, a very close friend of my father. In fact, they funded a synagogue together, to which this was my last kind of community life before I left Argentina. I am essentially an atheist, but I was very, very, very involved in the Jewish community. I mean, my father was president the Daya Foundation, which was the Jewish organization. So I know Danny. I have known Danny very, very, very well. I had no idea that the family came from Basarabia. No. That's an example, I think, of how strange that is, right? I mean, you would think you would know these things.
Maybe you know Samuel Cabanchik?
Cabanchik, I know him personally as well. He's also a philosopher. I mean, he studied, he teaches philosophy. I didn't know he was actually from Basarabia. Well, this is very strange. I mean, talking to Chisinau to find out that people that I already know quite well in Argentina come from the same place.
Yes, our encyclopedia is big, and Argentina is a big community of people from Basarabia. If I can help you with something, tell me, please.
Yeah, thank you.
In Argentina has the tense periods through the history. How your family has integrated with the change of regimes?
Look, I mean, for the Jews, the last military dictatorship was very, very tough, and the Peronists were also very tough. There was a part of Peronism from the 50s on, which was rabidly anti-Semitic. The Peronists had, there was a line that was written on graffiti on walls, which essentially was born and raised and developed during the Peronist period, which was "Be a patriot, kill a Jew." So as you can imagine, that was not a particularly hospitable context to be in. But I think that really belonged to the fringes of Argentinian society. So Argentinian society, as I was saying before, I think that Argentina, as any country, has anti-Semitism. I think that Argentina is not an anti-Semitic country. I mean, and I have a lot of criticism of Argentina. Don't get me wrong. I would not defend Argentina politically, but I think that this is something that to me is a fact. You do have anti-Semitism, but it's not an anti-Semitic country. Even in the most violent periods, like the military junta, where you did have, Jews particularly targeted, by and large, the community was more or less left alone. It's a very, I think that it's a very complicated story. I mean, to some degree, my family was, always kind of at the edge of the violence. I mean, we never received it directly, but we felt it very closely. So we had friends who were disappeared. My mother had acquaintances whose children were taken in the middle of the night and never came back. I know that my father had acquaintances at the university that were tortured and were killed. So that did happen. That did happen. And, obviously there being far-right groups, I also do remember myself from elementary school, once every so often having the police come into the school, the Jewish school, to sweep through to make sure that there were no bombs, because maybe there had been a threat of a bomb against the school or something like that. But I would say that generally the big issues of Argentina are other than anti-Semitism. Economics and political instability, that kind of thing.
You plan to come into the Republic of Moldova to film more details about the history of your family?
For the time being, I don't have a plan. I've been thinking about it. I'm really quite interested in returning to Orhei, probably with my family for a longer period of time. The funny thing is that over the last 3 years, I've been learning Russian, not for any political reason, simply because I want to read Gogol and Tolstoy in Russian. So I consume a lot of literature besides consuming a lot of food. So I've been working quite hard on Russian. But then when I found out that I was going to be doing work on Moldova, because I also like languages a lot, I started to study Romanian, really very intensely. So I'm thinking that, it would be kind of a perfect project. although I probably would have to decide on one of the two languages. Romanian obviously would be the more reasonable one. But since I have no plans to go to Russia to study Russian, then, this is something that it's interesting for me, the question of Russian in Moldova, if I may, because we were criticized, Deutsche Welle and our show, for conducting interviews in Russia, in Moldova, and having a lot of Ukrainian friends and Ukrainian colleagues, and knowing, besides having Ukrainian roots, I was thinking a lot about the question of Russia, the Russian language in Ukraine. And, you have to keep in mind that I'm a Jew living in Germany. So my father used to ask me, well, why? Why are you in Germany? How does that make sense? And I used to tell him, look, you are the one that first mentioned Goethe to me. It's not my fault. You're the one who first mentioned Heine to me, or that made me listen to Beethoven. It's not me, it was you. And I would follow up by saying that, I'm not willing to essentially grant the paternity of German culture to Nazis. It's not something that I borrow, German culture. It's mine. It's absolutely mine. And I'm here to reclaim something that belongs to me. Heine was a Jew after all. Mendelssohn was a Jew, and they read Goethe and they read, et cetera, et cetera. So meaning, I think that when I think about Ukraine and I see the anti-Russian language rhetoric, and I think about, okay, what happens with Russian speakers in Moldova, or Russian speakers in Lithuania, or Russian speakers, I think, we absolutely need to make the political statements, right? We are forced to say things about what we might think about Russian, but we should not forget that, my great grandfather, the Moldovan or the Bessarabian that came to Argentina, spoke Russian, although he did not have very nice things to say about their Russians, or the Cossacks in particular. And I think that he would have never thought of giving up the language for whatever is that, the Cossacks were doing. You cannot reduce Russian to the Cossack, or can you reduce German to the Nazis? And I think that, great Russian language writers in Ukraine, or great Russian language writers in Lithuania, or great Russian language writers in Moldova or Bessarabia should not be reduced to, Putin or to, I think that this to me, or Ivan the Terrible, this to me is really quite obvious. So in a sense, I think that we need to recuperate these things. Anyway, I'm sorry, that was a bit of an off-topic story.
It's okay. You need to find Mr. Daniel Goldin, who have the similar history like you. He is born in Argentina. He have Bessarabian roots and live in Germany. He is a choreographer and very good choreographer.
Daniel Goldin.
Goldin, sure.
I will look him up.
58 born in Buenos Aires, also born.
Okay, so but he's here. There was something else I forgot to tell you that I think it's a curious story. So we interviewed about so over the last couple of months we had your minister, your president, your minister. We even interviewed Ilan Shore. But in an interview with classes, the ones I usually wear, which are these ones, if I put them on, you will not see me. But and these were actually my great grandfather's glasses. My uncle gave them to me my last trip to Argentina. So they come actually from Orhei, and so we very briefly talk about that. He thought it was very funny that I was sort of carrying them, and he pointed them out to me. I didn't think about it, but when he pointed out to me, I was like, well, you know what? These things come from Orhei. And then we talked briefly about Orhei, and I was telling him that one of the things I remember is that in Yiddish, the expression "Are you from Orgiv?" which was it's Orgiev, I think in Russian, but in Yiddish was Orgiv. You come from Orgiv meant that was a question as to whether you're crazy. So being from Orgiv meant that you were a bit Yeah, you were crazy. And the reason for that is that apparently in the 19th century and early 20th century, there was a very famous mental institution in Orhei. So this is a story that I have not been able to confirm yet, but I know because I have an Yiddish teacher who is actually in Chisinau. He was telling me that this is very much the case, that this is something that Yiddish speakers in Chisinau still use. So when somebody says, "Are you from Orgiv?" means that you're crazy, or you're from Orgiv, or so there's a little bit of that.
This is funny. Tell me, please, what profession do you want to have when you are a child?
What I wanted to be when I was a child? Well, I wanted to be a rabbi, essentially. Mainly, I think I wanted to be a rabbi because I could give orders and people would follow them. So, I used to go to the synagogue with my parents. And I remember the rabbi saying, well, now we stand up and we read from page 100 and something of the prayer book, and people would stand up. And I thought that was somehow fascinating. So I would go home, I would stand with like some random book, and I would say, now we all stand up. And because I was, young and my grandparents and uncles and aunts were trying to keep me amused, they would stand up. Mm-hmm. So I figured, okay, maybe it's a career path. Then very quickly I switched roads, and it was quite clear that what I was going to do in the future would have something to do with thinking, probably, with philosophy. Although it was discouraged, they always told me that I would never make money with philosophy, which they were right, and I was wrong, I can say. But it was going to be something of the kind. I went to the US to study filmmaking. Very quickly, I found out that I didn't like filmmaking at all. And then I moved to philosophy, and that's actually how I ended up in journalism, which I tolerate if I don't love.
Mm-hmm. Let's speak about your work. When you decide to become a journalist, and what was the first experience?
I still don't really think of myself as a journalist, I would say. I mean, I think I feel myself as something else. I'm not really quite sure what. I think I am a producer. I mean, I am a producer, that I say, in the sense that I do a lot of project management and I bring parts together. I make sure that the camera guy is there, and I make sure that, everybody that has to be at work in time is there in time. That I would say that I am, but I would not say that I'm a journalist. I'm still a researcher, probably. I'm still an analyst. I still have, philosophical ideas or ideas that actually belong in the space of philosophy. I would not say that I'm a philosopher. I don't like people who say I am a philosopher. I feel that, those are like people who say I am a poet or I am a saint. I mean, I think that that's something that you would say. I would tell friends that one is a philosopher only 200 years after one dies. So one does not have the right to say I am a philosopher. But I mean, I am involved in things that have philosophical, let's say, accent or philosophical tastes. But I think that, journalism is something into which I fell. I needed a job. They were looking for somebody that knew something about Vatican politics, which is actually my area of expertise in television. And I ended up essentially in front of a camera talking about the Vatican. And that was it. That was more or less how I came into it. Explaining the situation with, Benedict's resignation, and then explaining sort of Francis and so on. And one thing led to the other, and that's how I ended up as a producer for Conflict Zone.
Mm-hmm. Which regions are more often covered by Conflict Zone program? Regions?
We essentially do foreign policy, so international politics, and for the last year and a half, we've been almost exclusively devoted to covering the war, the Russian war in Ukraine.
What will Europe look after this war is over?
I stopped making guesses. I will say, one day before the Russians invaded Ukraine, I put out a video on YouTube saying that the Russians would not invade Ukraine, that there was no chance of the Russians invaded Ukraine. The moment that they crossed the border, I pretty much decided that I probably should not be making guesses, particularly not with the Russians, who are pretty much capable of what I would suppose most reasonable operators would not be. My big fear, of course, is that what we will see in Western Europe is an ongoing process of destabilization. I'm now really quite worried that we will have in the next election cycle in different European countries, we will have a very hard swing to the right. So like Meloni in Italy, but maybe Le Pen in France, and maybe the AfD becoming more prominent in Germany, and maybe more of the right, Ciudadanos or PP with Vox in Spain. We already have like the Swedish Democrats with prominent roles, and the problem, of course, is that that is bad for one thing for European policy, I think. I mean, I am a conservative, or I consider myself quite conservative, but I have no liking at all for the far right. I think that is very dangerous for Europe. But I think that in the context of a very aggressive Russia, many of these actors are very friendly to Russia. So Le Pen would be very friendly to Russia. Meloni is not clear. I think she's very ambiguous about this, although she keeps doing everything that she has to do. But I think that you have people like Salvini in Italy who are very friendly to Russia. You have the AfD, which is certainly very friendly to Russia. So I think that these are things that worry me, because it could also shift quite radically the shape of Eastern Europe and the geostrategic makeup of Europe and the region. I think that, I'm also quite worried that we could see a second Trump sitting in the US. If we have a second Trump presidency, that could also shift very radically the way that Europe looks. But, these are just sort of speculations. Of course, in the end, you can always have something completely crazy happening, like, Putin invading Lithuania, or deciding that, in fact, after all, he can attack a NATO country like Poland and opening a front with NATO, in which case I think that you would have a radical shift away from these parties, because one of the things you can see is that at the beginning of the war, right-wing parties very quickly began to lose terrain, particularly, I think, because of their ambiguity towards the Russian position.
Your time is finished. Please, the last question. Give, please, an advice for a younger generation from Moldova.
I mean, there is always this problem, which is staying at home is too difficult, and going away looks like a solution. So I am a strong advocate of everybody going away. I think that people should travel, should see other places, learn other languages. But I think that there also has to be a re-evaluation of the place where one wants to set one roots and build. I think Moldova has sort of immense potential, right? I mean, it's clearly a country that stands with a lot to gain from European integration, and potentially, I think it's a place where you could have things that at this point you can no longer have in places like, in cities like France. I mean, in Chisinau, you can still do things that you cannot do in other capitals. So, I don't think I have a piece of advice. I mean, I think that it is really more a matter of we all are trying to figure out where do we belong and in what place we want to build our lives, and what and what is that makes us happy. I would say that one of the things I see among friends that are reaching the age of retirement is that they finish work that they didn't necessarily like, but then when it's over, they don't know what to do. And I realized that one of the most difficult things to understand is what things really move you, really to know what things is that you like. I think, you know, I have learned in these years that there are things that I like around food. I mean, I like journalism is not something that I love, but certainly thinking through issues is something that I do like a lot. It doesn't mean that I do it well. It just means that I like it. I like thinking or trying to think through issues. But I also like, you know, I started making cheese, or I started making salami. And as you can imagine, I mean, you know, a 6th-floor apartment in Berlin is not the best place to have goats and to make salami. So I think that, you know, understanding what is that one wants to do is probably much more important than understanding what is that one wants to get, or what is that one wants to make in terms of money, or how is it that one wants to be seen by others. I don't know if this is a very good answer, but I think that my point is perhaps sadly philosophical, which is that my biggest advice to anybody, friends and foes, is you do need to know yourself. You need to know what things turn you on and what things piss you off. Because I think that other than what pisses you off and what turns you on, the rest is essentially an errand. The rest is something that you do because you have to. So I still believe in a passionate engagement with the things you like.
Thank you very much for your time. If